Welcome to Healthcare du Jour, where we dish up and digest the latest in healthcare. For the next 30 minutes, sit back as we bring you insight, commentary, and discussion on trending topics to the table, all expertly served up by our host and his guests. Now here's your host, Matt Fisher.
Welcome back, and thank you for joining us as we dive into the hottest topics in healthcare. I'm your host, Matt Fisher. On the menu today is Angela Adams, CEO at Inflo Health. Angela, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Matt, for having me.
So, Angela, what I always like to do at the beginning of every show is to give my guests a chance to provide more of an introduction in terms of who they are and what they do. So, Angela, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I guess my background would start at nursing. I was an ICU nurse for the first decade of my career at Duke University Medical Center. I did cardiothoracic ICU, so that was mostly heart and lung transplants, and then moved into the CCU, which was basically taking care of pre-transplant patients. Left the hospital system after that and did something called legal nurse consulting, where I served as an expert witness for both plaintiff and defense on cases that kind of delved into that world of cardiothoracic and surgery and complications that could potentially happen to patients in that space. During my time in that LNC role, I did several products liability cases that came out of the medical device field and was recruited by a medical device company to come in and start a quality program around safe usage of their devices. During my time there, they recognized that though I was a clinician, I also had a great business acumen and head and sales strategy. And so they moved me through a series of positions. One of them was a seat on the mergers and acquisitions team. And that was my first time that I got to see the startup world. And if you are a passionate person about startup, you always remember that moment where you met your first startup and maybe met your first CEO of a startup and you were like, wow, this is the energy, this is the power, this is like where I want to be. And I very much saw that, and that's where I wanted to be. So I made the move to my first startup, and it was a healthcare. At that time, we weren't even calling it AI. We were calling it predictive analytics. And we were doing about 50 different predictions at the patient level to prevent what would be considered a preventable harm event. So went through that company that was called Javion. We sold that company in 2021 and started Inflo Health in that year. And now I am the CEO of Inflo Health.
That is a pretty interesting journey from, sounds like, the front lines of care through some traditional paths and then over into the startup world. So before we start talking about kind of what you're focused on now, the other thing I'm always curious about is, how did you get into healthcare in the first place?
Oh, great question. So when I was in college, I was pre-med, and I really always kind of, if you talk to my parents, I was always kind of obsessed with health. In fact, I came home one day from school and a kid in my class had diabetes. And I told my mom like everything there was to know about diabetes. And she was like, you were like 8 years old at the time. And so 2 years later, my dad ended up having all of these symptoms, and my mom remembered me telling her all of these like symptoms of diabetes. And she came back to me and was like, remember when you told me about that kid in your class that, and I was like, yeah. And I just started spouting everything off again. Well, sure enough, my dad had diabetes. And so that was probably my very first moment where I was like, I'm going to be a doctor. And so I went pre-med, and then I had one of my instructors was like, are you sure you want to do that? That's a lot of school. It's a lot of debt. It's a lot of all of these things. And he had a sister that was a nurse anesthetist and was like, why don't you go shadow my sister? She's a nurse that became an anesthetist. And so I did that, and I changed my major to nursing, and that was it.
That's pretty amazing. It's, to find the passion that early. And it's, it sounds like you've been able to kind of carry that through to all the different roles you've had across healthcare. So it's, I know you said the first startup you went to, you called it, the precursor to AI, which I'm guessing implies that you're now involved in AI, whether, depending on how you define it. So it's, if you don't mind, why don't you tell me what you're working on now and, kind of what you're focused on?
Yeah, absolutely. So Inflo Health has a mission of helping health systems never miss a follow-up, specifically to radiology follow-ups. We had a colleague that we all worked with. In fact, many of the team members on the Inflo team were previous members of our startup that we sold. And many of us knew this colleague was another nurse on the team. She went to the emergency room and had severe abdominal pain. And they were trying to figure out what was going on. They did a CT of her chest and abdomen, and they realized, oh, she has acute appendicitis. She needs to go to the operating room pretty much emergently, get this appendix out. But on that CT of the chest, incidentally, the radiologist found that she had a significant breast lesion that needed ASAP follow up, was suspicious for malignancy, put all of this in the report. But of course, she was already in the operating room and kind of going down the path of the emergent thing that needed to be fixed. Unfortunately, she just completely fell through the cracks and no one told her about the lesion. She went about 10 months on a delay to treatment and care. And she just ended up going to her regularly scheduled mammogram because she was in her 50s. So she was having a yearly mammogram. So she goes to her screening mammogram just like we all do, thinking everything's going to be fine. And then we're going to come back next year. Well, they found the lesion again. And they were like, why didn't you ever follow up on this? And of course, she was like, I have no idea what you're talking about. And they had to do a PET scan. And unfortunately, she ended up having metastatic breast cancer at that point, and it had traveled to her brain and was now an inoperable brain tumor. We were just devastated. We were like, how could this like happen? She's a nurse. She understands the health system. Like, why did no one tell her? And of course, she's going through all this intensive treatment to try to kick this cancer. And at the same time, we're all sitting around like scratching our heads like, does this happen? Like, does this happen often? When we started looking at the data, it happens 50%. This is a huge number, but it's true. 50% of radiology follow-ups that are dictated into the report from the radiologist of here is a finding, it needs this done, are just missed in general by the health system, the physician, the patient. Like there's multiple different failure points throughout this process. And we just couldn't believe that it was that often. And so we started doing the research into why, like, why is this? We got a little bit obsessed with the problem and figuring out like, where are all of these failure points and could we solve it? In the midst of all of that, she went through all of her treatment, but unfortunately, she passed away in 2021, which was the year that we started Inflo Health with this mission. So I always say, like, we dedicate this to her and to all of the patients out there that had a missed, opportunity. And that's what we're really trying to help both the patient and the health system and the providers come together in an automated fashion so that this never occurs. So what did we actually build? We built I know you are familiar with the term LLM, large language model. There's tons of examples out there, OpenAI, ChatGPT, Claude, Grok, you name it. What we ended up having to do is build our own proprietary language model that was specific to radiology language. So it could read and interpret radiology language from reports because these are dictated reports. So a radiologist dictates this long contextual report, and then that's the report that goes across to the electronic medical record and to the provider that ordered it. It's really hard, though, to understand which one of these has a follow-up and which doesn't, because there's not discrete fields throughout this report. It's just one big, and every radiologist speaks, in a different way. And so the first thing we had to do was build that language model. The second thing we did was we layered on all of this, what I would call natural language processing or natural language understanding, to then delineate all of the different follow-ups into different types. So is it an incidental finding? Is it a breast lesion? Is it a lung lesion? Is it over here? Like, where does it need to go as far as a workflow and care navigation after the fact? I would say most of our competitors, that's where they stopped. They were like, well, this is going to be the cool part, right? The AI, that's going to be the cool part. And so that's going to be the value, is just getting it from the radiology report to the work list. When we were delving into all of the failure points, though, that was not primarily the failure point. That was one of them. The failure point was really then taking it from that work list. They had people manually going into that work list and being like, oh, who's the provider for this patient? Now let me reach out to them and let me make sure that they have an order and that they have a pre-auth for the insurance and they have a scheduled event. And then the patient, right? Reaching out to the patient and making sure that the patient was aware, like, hey, you were in the ER, you had an incidental finding, here's what we need you to do about it, and kind of guiding that. So what we ended up really spending the majority of our time building, not just the AI and the cool part, but is all of those automated workflows to communicate back to the provider inside of the EHR to start that whole process to track and measure that completion, but then also engaging the patient at the right time in the care and completely closing that loop. So that's what Inflo Health does today.
Yeah, that's a very kind of complex and comprehensive system, and it's really amazing as you described it as well. Unfortunately, coming out of very sad circumstances, but it also seems like it relates back to how you described why you got into healthcare in the first place, where you saw something and all of a sudden you really started diving deep and learning all about it, which kind of brings. And I think you start to answer this question. But you talked about all the potential times when follow-ups might be missed. Did you find particular causes why, and how did that then inform how you went about trying to reduce the likelihood that each of the causes for a miss would occur again?
Yeah. In fact, if you look at some of these early like whiteboards and scratch boards that we went through, it's like failure point, failure point, failure point, failure point. Like there's so many opportunities for this to fail. You see why it fails 50% of the time. Because even if we go back to that ER patient example, so the patient comes to the ER, they're having imaging done because they're in the middle of an emergency, right? And the imaging today is getting so good. There's so much detection and AI detection on these images that we're picking up about 40% more of these, what we call incidentals or incidentalomas. So the ER physician is looking for what's going to kill you in the next 24 hours. That radiologist is looking for anything that potentially is wrong inside of your body at the moment. The ER doctor is not going to be able to solve that, right? So that's not the right provider. But then let's say that you do have a primary care doctor that needs to know that information, but they're not connected to that health system. So then how does that referring provider that is not connected to that health system get the information that their patient was in the ER, that they now have an incidental finding or a nodule that needs to have follow-up done, that they need to place a order that needs to go back to the original system. So it's just a nature of what the failure points were is you've got a patient in the middle, and then you've got a health system, and then you've got providers, and then you've got out of network providers. And like, how do you get a continuous care pathway for that patient so that it doesn't seem like, wait, what am I supposed to be doing? Like I went to the ER because I had chest pain and now you're telling me I have a lung nodule and I need to go see if I have lung cancer. Like that seems big and that seems like a heavy thing. So we really just looked at every single failure point in that process and we were like, what can we apply automation to and how can we guide and care navigate? So now that ER patient will get a message from Inflo within 24 hours of leaving the ER saying, hey, you were in this ER yesterday, you had a radiology and imaging exam, and we found something that was concerning enough that the radiologist wants you to have a follow-up. So we'll then guide them back to their primary care provider. At the same time, we send a message to the primary care provider within their EHR or electronic fax, which a lot of them use if they're not using the same EMR. And we say, hey, guess what? Your patient was in the ER yesterday and they had this finding. Would you like to order this now? That way, if the patient forgets to go to the provider or the provider forgets to do something, you've got kind of both parties moving towards each other and one of them likely will catch it. So you're engaging the patient in their own care, but then helping the provider be there at the right time to support their patient. And now that we have so much automation and agentic AI kind of working for us, like you can do most of this, like 80% of this is closed within automation, which without even one human having to touch it.
Yeah, that's a pretty amazing extension of what's capable from technology. And for those of you just joining, I'm talking with Angela Adams from Inflo Health, talking about missed follow-ups and how to really try to capture incidental findings and drive better engagement. And Angela, as you were just talking about it, of having engagement to both the clinician side and the patient side, I think that's probably a very powerful piece to it, because it's, as you said, it's really informing both sides and giving everyone the opportunity to come together and then pursue the next steps of care.
It really is. I think we've had health systems before that are like, ooh, we don't really want to reach out to the patient. Like, we just want the provider to do the right thing. But is that like what we owe the patient? I feel like we owe the patient the ability to engage in their own care, right? And give them the responsibility as well to be like, oh, they're telling me I have a thing. I need to go do this thing. And by not putting them in that loop, we're putting all of the onus again back on the provider, and we're creating this environment where the provider has to be like doing heroics every day in order to accomplish all of the things that need to be done to keep every single one of their patients safe, versus spreading out that responsibility and being like, hey, patient, you got this. Like, help us get this done, and provider, help us get this done. And bringing those worlds together has been, I think, what's really led to the success of keeping our follow-up closure rates really high.
So as you're deploying that type of a solution, what were some of the hurdles or, maybe resistance or other challenges that you had to overcome to get people to, adopt it and then see the benefit that could derive from helping automate that process?
It's interesting because this is a super easy use case for AI for people to see the value in, right? When you talk about there's a patient safety component, everybody is like, yeah, we get that. There's a mitigating of liability component. Everybody's like, yeah, we get that. There's a driving of revenue component that the hospital systems get very excited about, because 50% of their follow-ups are sitting there. Think of how much revenue in imaging is sitting there in untapped opportunity dollars. And then we're taking it one step further to that like staff efficiency of how do you use your humans and your very expert knowledge, care navigators at the top of their license versus having them sit in spreadsheets every day. So we basically there's not really, everybody sees that part of it, right? They all get the value. The pushback comes in waves of, well, whose responsibility is this at the end of the day, right? Is it the ER, that the ER doc gets off shift and then is out for the next 7 days and comes back to shift, and now what, they're supposed to manage this patient that came in for 2.5 hours? Is it the primary care doctor that may or may not be employed by the hospital? Is it the patient's responsibility? So that's usually where we start to get into some real workflow diagrams with the teams. As you know, you might know this or might not, we're a high reliability organization, and many of our health systems that we serve are HROs as well. And we get pretty obsessed with the details, the problems, and like, where are these failure points? In fact, we did a partnership with the American College of Radiology. They have a program called Empower. And what we love about it is that they go into health systems, they create these cohorts where there's like 4 or 6 health systems in each cohort. It lasts about 6 months, but they help hospitals build high reliability follow-up management programs. Well, they invited us to the table because they were like, man, these health systems are trying to build these high reliability follow-up management programs, but because they're trying to do it with all humans, it's like failing over and over and over again. It really needs to be technology that comes to the table so that 80% of this can be done by AI automation, and all of the the high reliability variations can be controlled. And when we came in, they were so excited to have us, and our results for our clients have just been phenomenal. Most of our health systems go from like follow-up closure rates of 40% to 80% within this 6-month time frame, because you're solving to all of those different failure points. You're pushing onto technology everything that can possibly be solved by the tech. And then you're saying, okay, this is a problem that the technology cannot solve. So this is what your team needs to be working on. Like, I'm not going to be able to fix that you don't have access for your MRIs, right? Like you got to go fix that problem. But I can tell you how many MRI patients I'm going to push to you in the next 3 months, and you can go figure out how to provide that access. So by doing partnerships like that, I think we've been able to really bring together a high reliability process that solves to all of these different failure points and uses the tech to its greatest advantage.
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear that, as you said, because you're able to solve for a cascade of different failure points and, as you say, kind of isolate or minimize the issues that have failed because you're missing something to, broader operational issues. It's interesting, as I said, that you described pushback then being worried about whose responsibility is for what obligation there, because if, as you're saying, half of the follow-ups are being missed, from my perspective, that seems like the bigger liability because you're missing half of the things that you should have been treating. Whereas if you deploy the technology and allow for this automation that can do a better job of capturing all these additional items and following up, now you're narrowing down that potential exposure because you've, as you said, you've gotten these tools to extend your capabilities and be able to handle things that were just not occurring at all before.
Yeah, it's just that the hospital system is so siloed. So it's like, okay, so who owns this? Does radiology own this? Because it seems like a much bigger problem than that, right? Based on what you just said, it's really a quality problem. So does quality own this? And then quality is like, well, it's not our problem. So like, does the primary care provider own it? And they're like, well, we're sitting outside the health system. Like, how are we going to own this? So it's really like you've got to, as a tech vendor, bring together this multidisciplinary group of owners and create the responsibility path to be like, here's the piece that you're responsible for. Here's the piece that you're responsible. Like, we're all responsible for the patient, and everybody has their onus and responsibility. And so by crafting that, it's interesting though, because most people think, oh, you're a tech vendor. All you do is like build tech, and then you like press a button and it's like live in the health system, right? And I wish it was like an easy button like that. But if you've been in AI and healthcare long enough, you've noticed that it's not the AI that's failing. It's the integration into the clinical workflow that's failing. And that's because you're not bringing together the right workflow or the right group of people. And so it really does rely on this people, process, tech, like all coming together at the same beautiful moment to create something that's sustainable and high reliability. I would say most early tech AI vendors that are not from the healthcare space that are like, oh, I'm going to build this cool thing for healthcare and it's going to be awesome. And they think it's a technology challenge. Typically, the technology is the easy part. It's the health system and all of the kind of broken systems within the hospital that then you're going to help repair as you're trying to get a solution to be successful within a very chaotic, complex environment. In fact, me and Candace Garcia Tompkins of the ACR have our own podcast called Success in Chaos. And it's literally talking to people who are trying to drive success in this very chaotic environment of the health system. And how do you do that when it seems like everything is breaking apart and wheels are falling off? It's complex.
It raises a really insightful point, which is, you always hear people say, you peel one layer back in healthcare and then you realize that there is another like 50 or 60 below that. And the fact that, as you describe, and as you described, you're actually solving for trying to capture as many layers as possible. So, correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like you're helping, the people that you're working with actually identify that there are more pieces involved than they might think there could be. And you're aware of it because, as you said, you're coming from the healthcare background and the understanding that there's always all these interconnected pieces that are going to be involved.
Absolutely. In fact, like our clients have described it. I think this is one of the funnier ones. So, Epic has a tool inside of the EHR that they're like, oh, we can tell you which incidentals are in the report. And one of the clients described it as, yeah, it's kind of like getting a piece of IKEA furniture and trying to put it together on your own, right? There's so many complexities. It sounds easy, like, oh, we're just going to turn on this work list. But if you haven't solved all of those other clinical workflow questions that I just kind of went through, then like it's not as easy as just turning on a work list. And so if you don't have a vendor that you've made a choice with that can really walk you through what are all these decision points, who do we need to have at the table, who makes this successful, what do we measure, what are the controllables, what are the variables that we can't control, like that's really all the hardest part. The tech at the end of the day, easy to build tech, right? Hard to implement tech.
Yeah, no, and I think that kind of bears out when we've seen so many companies try to develop and come in and say, oh, we have this type of technology in the consumer world. It should be really easy to translate. But then, there is a lot of truth to the healthcare is just different. But Angela, believe it or not, we're already almost out of time. So I'm going to close with a final question, which is, kind of given all these changes, what is your kind of bold prediction of what do you think is going to most shake up, healthcare when it comes to deployment and integration of technology to assist all the processes in the next couple of years?
Yeah, I mean, for the health system, it's going to be how quickly can they bring in technologies to help support, especially back office functionalities on the operations side. And I'm really talking about agentic AI. So how do you use agentic AI to offset some of the manual human-led tasks and really allow your staff to work at the top of their license while agentic AI is taking care of all of the layer that really can be automated with tech? That's going to be the health systems that figure that out the fastest are going to be the most competitive.
Yeah, definitely seems like a very apt prediction. It kind of goes back to a lot of what you were saying earlier of you actually need to solve and, help processes move forward. And, just catching a headline is not going to do that. But as I said, believe it or not, we are already out of time. And I want to thank my guest, Angela Adams, for a great conversation today.
Thank you so much, Matt.
And thank you to everyone listening. Keep the dialogue going and connect with me at #HCDEJURE. I'm Matt Fisher. Until next time.